Hi everyone, it's Lauren at Love Renovate here. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. Today I'm going to be chatting about 5 things that people typically forget to budget for when they are renovating. So when we're starting to plan a renovation in the budget, we tend to think of the big ticket items such as the architect's fees and planning permission application. We think about the big chunky labour and build costs. And also things like if you're getting a new kitchen, bathroom, so the big ticket items we often budget for and have them covered. But there's other costs that people tend to forget about that do add up. So we're going to cover off 5 that we think are big ones and popular ones that people forget about. There will be others, but these are just ones that we think you should have in the front of your mind and make sure you include them in the budget. So the first one that people often forget about are the building control costs. So we obviously, as I said before, we think about the planning application, architect's fees, but building control is something that's non-avoidable if you're doing any renovation work such as an extension, loft conversion. You will need to submit to get building control approval. So these fees are listed on your local authority's website. And they tend to be based on the size of the work you're doing and then the type. So loft conversion cost is different to like an extension, that kind of thing. But they should have them clearly laid out in a table. If you don't, you can get in touch with them. And the building control fees are split into 2 costs. The first one is the actual application. So that tends to cost about £200 to £300 depending where you are in the country for something such as a standard loft conversion or a standard extension. And then the other part of the fees are the building inspector's charge. You don't need to go with your local authority, you can go with a private building inspector, but you're going to have to set aside a budget regardless. And that is about £400 to £500 depending on where you are based in the country. For something like a loft conversion or an extension, you should put that aside. So for building control costs, expect to budget anyway around £600 to £800 and make sure you have that in there because it's a chunky cost. And you don't want to miss something like that is you have to pay it, you can't avoid it, you can't save money on it. The second one that people often forget about is VAT at 20%. Now, when you start looking at the overall budget, you'll come across lots of websites that will say maybe something like the labour and build cost will be £2,000 to £2,500 per square metre. But that probably won't include VAT at 20%, so you need to make sure you include that. Similarly, if you are getting the builders to quote, again, they should say this is X VAT and then add it on, but just make sure when you're getting their tenders back that it definitely includes VAT. You don't want to have a nasty surprise if you're getting 20% off the end. You can work with some people that aren't VAT registered, but if you're going down working with a kind of building company that are going to be doing it for you, it's most likely they will be VAT registered and you have to pay 20%. If you go into our cost calculator, for example, it will include VAT in there. So that will be covered if you put, like, say your extension is going to be 20 metres squared, we will include that in there. But just be mindful that not every website will quote that and you need to add that on. So the third thing is the cost of a boiler. So if you're moving into a house that's a kind of renovation project, it's likely that the boiler won't have been touched for a while. And it's also the opportunity, you may say you want to move the boiler. So say it has taken up room in the kitchen, you might want to move it into the garage or somewhere else to give you more space in your home. So it's a time where you might want to move things about or move it somewhere else in your kitchen, for example. So replacing a boiler would cost you about £2,000 to £3,000 if it's a simple swap out. If you're moving it somewhere else in your home, expect to pay a bit more because you're going to be paying for more of the pipe work. And then the other thing is if you're doing like a loft conversion or an extension where you're adding on an extra bathroom, if you're making your house bigger, there's more people going to be living in it and more demand on the water, then it's a really good time to think about a pressurised hot water system, such as you may have heard like a Megaflow. But that again, it will cost you more, so expect to budget about £1,000, £1,500 for that. So if you're wanting to replace the boiler or hot water system, expect to budget about £3,000, add that into your budget for that. Because you don't want to do a renovation and your boiler's on its last legs and you've kind of nursed it along the way and then you need to do that afterwards and kind of disrupt your house again. So it's a good time to get everything like that sorted. The fourth thing that people often forget about is lots of the interiors finishes. So when your builder is quoting you for the labour and build and their materials, unless they specify, you agree with them to put aside a budget for things like paint, they probably won't include that. That won't be included in their core materials cost. So make sure you budget for things people often forget about are like downlights, light finishes, skirtings, doors, paint, all those things. Make sure you've got a budget. You may want to sit down with the builder, as I said, and actually can they source paint, say at trade, or there are different things that they can source, but make sure that is included in their quote and they've set about an amount aside in there for you. But when you're doing your initial budget, make sure you do include all of that, because the small items really add up. And you don't want to get to the end of your build having a really tight control of the cost, and then you've got an extra £2,000 spent on all these other finishes that you just hadn't thought about. And then you don't want to maybe scrimp on a light that a dream light that you would have loved, and then you end up getting something much cheaper that you don't like as much. You just make sure you include that in the budget. The fifth thing that people often forget about that's so important is contingency. Now, the contingency we recommend should be today about 15 to 20%. It feels like a lot, but the contingency should be used for things such as issues with foundations that the builder, you haven't seen that when they were giving you the initial quote. It could be things like damp, different issues, structural issues that are uncovered during the process that you will need to pay for. So that typically the contingency was always used to cover that. Having seen construction costs rise over the past couple of years, and with the increased pressure on cost of living, it's also sensible to make sure your contingency is a bit bigger, as we say 15 to 20% to cover any other additional costs that might crop up. In today's world, there's a likelihood that we might see prices rise. So it's so sensible going into your renovation, make sure you have a chunky contingency. If you don't spend it, great, you can use it for some other finishes, but it's most likely that you will use that contingency. So there are 5 things, just to kind of cover them again. Building control costs, number 1. Number 2 is VAT at 20%. Number 3 is replacing a boiler, hot water tank. Number 4 is any of the interiors and finishes such as lights fittings and paint. And number 5 is make sure you have a good contingency. We hope you found that useful, and we'd love to hear your comments below, or either email me, lauren@loverenovate.co.uk.